The lobby of the luxury hotel gleamed with golden light. Marble floors stretched wide under the feet of wealthy travelers, their luggage clicking as attendants rushed to take their bags. Behind the front desk, the manager stood stiff, his collar slightly damp from nervous sweat. He was a man used to control, used to order, but at this very moment, he was cornered by something as simple, and as humiliating, as a language barrier. A millionaire from France had arrived unannounced. His private jet had landed that morning, and he had come straight to the hotel with no reservation. He was tall, dressed in a navy suit, his watch glinting with diamonds, and every word he spoke rolled off his tongue in fast, sharp French. The manager, despite his polished English, despite his experience handling VIPs, had not prepared for this. He stood frozen, trying to understand even one sentence, but the Frenchman's words were a rapid-fire storm, each one more incomprehensible than the last. "Oui, monsieur, pardon, monsieur," the manager stammered, his face reddening. He nodded uselessly, flipping through the system on his computer, but he couldn't even confirm what the guest wanted. A room, a suite, a transfer. Every second of silence felt like a knife. Guests nearby began to watch. Staff members glanced toward the desk. The Frenchman's eyebrows narrowed in irritation. He raised his voice, repeating himself, sharper this time, clearly frustrated at not being understood. The manager's panic grew. He thought quickly, was there anyone in the staff who could help? The concierge? No, he only knew bits of Spanish. The assistant manager? He had studied Italian, not French. The manager cursed under his breath, beads of sweat rolling down his temple. If this situation spiraled further, the hotel's reputation could take a hit. They couldn't afford to offend a man of such wealth and influence. Behind them, almost unnoticed, a maid was dusting the ornate vases placed along the lobby wall. She was dressed in the simple black uniform of the housekeeping staff, her hair tied back neatly, her skin glowing a deep, rich brown under the chandelier lights. She had been working quietly, invisible to most, as she often was. Her name was Amara. She had been in this country for only a few years, but in that time, she had learned that people like her, maids, cleaners, attendants, were often seen but rarely heard. She paused, watching the scene unfold, her eyes narrowing slightly. She recognized the sounds of the Frenchman's words. To her, they were not foreign, not intimidating. They were the familiar sounds of her own second language. She had grown up in Senegal, where French was spoken fluently in schools and markets alike. She had spoken it long before she had even learned English. Amara bit her lip for a moment, considering. Should she speak? It was not her place to interfere in the affairs of the front desk. Maids were expected to keep their heads down, to clean, to fade into the background. But as she watched the manager flounder, watched the Frenchman's growing impatience, she knew she couldn't remain silent. The Frenchman leaned forward, his voice booming now, startling the manager. He was demanding clarity, demanding respect. The manager opened his mouth but only stuttered again, helpless. That was when Amara stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Excusez-moi, monsieur," she said in perfect, fluid French, her accent refined and natural. "Je peux vous aider. Qu'est-ce que vous désirez exactement?" The Frenchman froze, his anger halting mid-sentence. His eyes shifted from the red-faced manager to the maid who stood, dust cloth still in hand, speaking his language with effortless grace. For a moment, silence fell in the lobby. Guests who had been watching leaned in slightly, curious. The manager blinked, his jaw slack, as though he had just witnessed a miracle. Amara continued, her tone polite but confident. "Souhaitez-vous une suite particulière? Ou parlez-vous de votre transfert depuis l'aéroport?" Her words flowed without hesitation, her composure unshaken. The Frenchman's expression softened. Relief flickered in his eyes. Finally, someone understood him. His tense posture relaxed as he answered her, this time slower, clearer. He explained that he had requested the presidential suite and wanted his luggage sent up immediately. He also needed a car arranged for a meeting later in the evening. Amara nodded, translating his words smoothly into English for the manager. He would like the presidential suite prepared right away and his luggage brought up. He also needs a car arranged for this evening. The manager scrambled, typing furiously into the computer, nodding as though he had known all along. "Yes, of course, yes," he said quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was clear to everyone who had saved him from disaster. Amara turned back to the Frenchman, smiling warmly as she confirmed everything in his language. The millionaire gave a small chuckle, visibly impressed, and for the first time since his arrival, his voice carried no anger. He looked at her not as a maid, not as a silent figure in the background, but as someone who had met him on equal ground. As porters rushed to carry his luggage and the suite keys were prepared, the Frenchman gave Amara a nod of gratitude. "Merci beaucoup, mademoiselle," he said with genuine respect. She bowed her head slightly. "C'est un plaisir, monsieur." The manager finally exhaled, relief washing over him, though his pride was bruised. He glanced at Amara, struggling to reconcile the image of a maid in uniform with the eloquent, fluent French he had just heard. She had done what he could not. She had saved both him and the hotel from embarrassment. But Amara simply returned to her duties, lifting her dust cloth once more, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She did not bask in the attention, nor did she seek recognition. To her, it was a simple act, using the knowledge she carried quietly within her. Yet to everyone else who had witnessed it, the moment was far from simple. It was a reminder that brilliance and skill do not always wear expensive suits or stand behind polished desks. Sometimes, they move silently through hallways with a broom or cloth in hand, unseen until the moment they are most needed. The lobby slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere had shifted. Guests whispered about the maid who spoke flawless French. The Frenchman's anger had vanished, replaced by satisfaction. And the manager, though relieved, could not ignore the lesson staring him in the face. Amara walked away quietly, her heart steady, her dignity intact. She had not spoken for applause, nor for recognition. She had spoken because it was right, and in that moment, she had turned a crisis into calm. The day continued, but the story of that moment would linger in the marble walls of the hotel far longer. The presidential suite doors closed with a soft click as porters wheeled in the Frenchman's gleaming luggage. The manager had plastered a smile across his face, bowing and apologizing in broken English for any slight inconvenience. But deep inside, his chest still throbbed with humiliation. He had been exposed, not just in front of a guest, but in front of his staff, in front of everyone. He had stood helpless while a maid had solved the problem he could not. The Frenchman, on the other hand, was in a very different mood. As he stepped into his grand suite, he found the marble bathroom spotless, the fresh flowers arranged neatly, and the city skyline shimmering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Yet what lingered most in his mind was not the view, nor the opulence, but the young maid who had spoken his mother tongue with such elegance. He replayed her words in his mind, the calmness in her tone, the assurance she carried even in her humble uniform. Later that afternoon, the manager called an emergency meeting with the senior staff. His tone was sharp, his frustration thinly veiled. "What happened this morning," he said, his eyes darting toward anyone but Amara, "was unacceptable. We must be prepared for every situation, especially with international guests. We cannot allow incidents like that to repeat themselves." The staff nodded, some nervously, others suppressing knowing smiles. They had seen what had happened. They knew the truth, that without Amara, the hotel's reputation might have been tarnished. But the manager could not bring himself to praise her openly. His pride was too wounded. Instead, he spoke vaguely of teamwork and preparedness, as though the problem had been some collective oversight, rather than his own failure. Amara sat quietly at the back of the room, her eyes lowered. She wasn't expecting applause. Still, a flicker of disappointment touched her heart. She had stepped in only to help, not to embarrass anyone. But she could not ignore the way the manager's voice tightened whenever his eyes swept past her. He saw her not as an asset, but as a reminder of his own inadequacy. That evening, as the sun sank and the golden lights of the city shimmered outside the tall windows, Amara was assigned to bring fresh linens to the upper suites. She knocked gently on the presidential suite door, half expecting only a porter to answer. But it was the Frenchman himself who opened it. His sharp features softened when he saw her. "Ah, mademoiselle," he said warmly in French, "the one who saved me from a dreadful misunderstanding this morning." Amara hesitated, shifting the basket of linens in her arms. "I was only helping, monsieur. It was nothing." "Nothing," he laughed, stepping aside to let her enter. No, no, it was not nothing. Do you know how rare it is, in this part of the world, to find someone who speaks my language with such grace? You made me feel at home, even here, thousands of miles away. She placed the linens carefully on the side table, her posture modest, her voice measured. I am glad I could be of assistance. The Frenchman studied her for a moment. He noticed the steadiness of her gaze, the quiet dignity in her manner. She carried herself not like a servant, but like someone with self-respect, someone who knew her worth even if others could not see it. Tell me, if you don't mind, he asked gently, where did you learn French? Amara hesitated again, unused to being questioned by guests in this way. In Senegal, monsieur, it is one of our official languages. I studied it in school, and at home, it was part of our lives. Senegal, the Frenchman repeated thoughtfully. Of course, I should have known. Your accent, it is pure, clear. You speak as though you were raised in Paris itself. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Merci, monsieur, that is kind of you to say. For a long moment, silence filled the suite, but it was not uncomfortable. The Frenchman seemed to consider something, as though weighing his next words carefully. Finally, he said, you have talent, mademoiselle. More talent than this place seems to recognize. Why do you work as a maid? The question startled her. She lowered her gaze again. Life brings us where it will, she said softly. Opportunities are not the same for everyone. I needed work, and the hotel gave it to me. That is enough. The Frenchman frowned, clearly dissatisfied with her answer. He saw intelligence in her eyes, refinement in her speech. He had met diplomats, scholars, and artists who carried themselves no differently than she did. Yet here she was, folding linens and sweeping halls. At that very moment, the manager entered the suite, his smile tight, his tone overly polite. Monsieur, I trust everything is satisfactory. The Frenchman nodded but kept his gaze fixed on Amara. Yes, very satisfactory, thanks to your staff. Especially this young woman. The manager's jaw clenched. He forced a small laugh. Yes, our staff is well trained. He glanced at Amara, a flicker of irritation in his eyes, as though silently warning her not to say anything further. But the Frenchman was not done. Do you know, he said, turning back to the manager, if not for her, I might have left your establishment entirely. She is the reason I feel comfortable here. You should treasure employees like her. They are rare. The manager's face stiffened, his forced smile faltering. He bowed his head slightly. Of course, monsieur, we value all of our employees. Amara lowered her eyes again, her hands clasped in front of her, but inside, her heart swelled with quiet pride. For once, her skills had been seen, not by her employer, not by her manager, but by someone who recognized worth beyond uniforms and titles. After the manager left, the Frenchman leaned closer and lowered his voice. Never let anyone convince you that you are less than what you are. Your knowledge, your language, it is power. Do not hide it. She nodded gently, though she did not reply. Words like his were rare in her world, where maids were expected to blend into the walls. Yet she tucked them into her heart like a secret gift, a reminder that her worth was not defined by the uniform she wore. That night, when Amara returned to her small shared room in the staff quarters, she sat quietly by the window, staring at the stars. She thought of her journey, of the struggles that had brought her here, of the long hours scrubbing floors and changing sheets. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream, not just of surviving, but of something more. And though she did not know it yet, her life was already beginning to shift. The Frenchman had noticed her, respected her, and perhaps, in the days to come, he would change the course of her story in ways the manager could never have imagined.